welcome to General Admission, a podcast playing some tunes, talking about those songs, and making you more aware of music that you might have missed. I'm John Krutoff, your loudmouth host for the evening, or the day, or the morning, or whenever you're listening to this. This episode continues my exploration of hardcore and punk music of 1982 as part of the Hardcore 82 March Madness fun I've been having on Twitter. So this month I'm digging into the deep cuts that didn't make the top 64 songs in my not so humble opinion. To further extrapolate on the point I've been making over the last couple of months, listen to this month's post and think about how many of these songs are better than anything made since. Or even if you want to make it even easier on me, think about how these songs are better, or at least some of these songs are better than anything you've heard this year, or last year, or in this decade. I suspect that the 20 songs played today stack up at the top 20 or 30 songs in most other calendar years. And remember, these are songs that I didn't think made the 64 cut. So I'm going to focus this episode on UK punk and some of it's hardcore-ish, and I've got a set of US stuff at the end. So we'll be, traveling some well-known ground. So first up, some UK punk from 1982 that didn't make that cut. For the most part, I fall on the hardcore side of the punk equation. I got into punk in 86. I was listening to hardcore. These are the early punk stuff always sounded a bit wimpy and too song oriented. Now, as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate and like those things, but still, my heart says you have to have some sort of edge or fast or aggression there to make it a song that I feel really resonates with me. So, some of these examples are bands that have put out records that are maybe a little past their peak, maybe a little not hitting their stride yet. 82, though, was full of chock full of great releases. So if your favorite band is included in this episode, if you're not, it's not because they're shit. It's just because they're not putting out one of the 64 best songs that year. So to start, let's hear something from the Attics.
Everybody's dreaming, but someone's gonna try.
In that set, I played The Addicts, Eyes in the Back of Your Head off of the Songs of Praise LP, which came out on Razor Records, but has since been reissued by Captain Oi, who seem to be reissuing every goddamn UK 82 record that ever existed. And of course, that came out in 1982. The Addicts are a divisive band. Either they're too melodic or too jokey for your tastes, or you just can't get behind the fact that somebody is dressing up as a Droog from A Clockwork Orange into their 60s. Either way, I don't have a strong opinion about the Addicts. I kind of like their songs, in fact, probably more than I should as a fully grown human adult. But Songs of Praise is their second full length. And while some of the songs on here are their catchy trademark songs, and, you know, if you go see them this month, next month, in a year, in 5 years, they'll be playing some of those songs. And, you know, let's face it, Songs of Praise and the first LP are probably the only thing you'll ever need to own by them. And thankfully, they haven't, you know, done what other UK 82 and a lot of bands that have gotten back together done, and that is write a new album. Because, frankly, no one wants to hear your new shit. Just play your old shit. The Addicts at least get that right. You can hear that the Addicts have something in common with the US hardcore records that I'll play later, especially the stuff from California. And early on, you can hear the influence on the singing sort of stuff that was coming out of California. So if you're, you know, looking for a theme to open and close this, there it is. Sing-along punk, catchy as fuck, competently performed, and probably a little bit to blame for the pop punk stuff that came out of California and then spread like a virus throughout the world. So again, that may be a reason that you either love or hate the band. I will say that historically, at least in the UK, a lot of people bought this record. It peaked at number 2 in the UK independent charts and was there for 13 weeks. That means it sold a fuck ton of records. After that, I played Stiff Little Fingers, the song Touch and Go off of Now Then, which was a much more produced, polished version of what people had heard before from Stiff Little Fingers. I think losing some of the roughness loses some of the charm that Stiff Little Fingers have on the first 2 records at least. Nonetheless, it's a decent album, albeit a bit softer than the first 2, and it's not going to be something that I reach for immediately, but something I'll turn to if it happens to fall into the rotation of the digital shuffle on my daily work. Stiff Little Fingers should need no real introduction. They're a fairly big band, writing one of the best punk songs ever in Suspect Device and being a consistent band throughout their career. Ironically, Now Then was the breakup album for the band, which we now know in hindsight wasn't quite true. Jake Burns had this to say about Now Then. Our last LP, Now Then, was to my mind the best album we have made. But it is also unfortunately the best thing I think we will ever make, so I've decided to call it a day. Of course, we know that Stiff Little Fingers would start back up again in 1987, a mere 5 years later. So take that for what it's worth. The question really is, have they put out a good record since then? Again, yours to decide. Now, being the contrarian that I am, I can definitively say that Now Then is not the best Stiff Little Fingers record. It's certainly not the best full length. The the singles are way superior to anything that appears on Now Then. And I gotta say that, Inflammable Material is probably the best record. I think that's not even a controversial subject to bring up. But in Jake's defense, what the fuck is he supposed to say? If somebody says, is this your best record yet? You, of course, are going to answer, yeah. After them, I played the UK subs, Endangered Species, off the album of the same name from, yeah, you guessed it, 1982. I have to say that while I was never a fan of the UK subs when I was younger, again, they came to me far too late. I had heard too many sort of mind-blowing hardcore bands for the UK subs, which play at a kind of a mid-tempo and didn't really resonate with me in, my 14-year-old self. I've come to really appreciate what they were doing. And the lineup with Charlie Harper, Alvin Gibbs, Nicky Garrett is such a classic that even as the band decided to become a little less punk and a little more commercial, they didn't lose too much of an edge. Endangered Species kind of describes that to a T. He was held up on legal issues, so some of it came out in actually 1981, which is kind of an interesting thing. So the singles for the record came out in 81, but the full LP didn't come out until 82. The whole album has some parts that lag, and it is, for those who have a short attention span like I do, especially growing up on hardcore where an LP of longer than 20 minutes was probably a little too long for your tastes, this album will feel like it's a bit dragging. But from 2019's perspective, it's a perfectly good punk album, and I've seen way too many punk bands who can't even get to this level play. So, much like the Stiff Little Fingers album, it's not the subs at their peak, but most of the first wave of UK punk bands who cropped up just after the Pistols, Damned, and Clash, this is 5 or 6 years later. They're going to be running out of a little bit of steam. The UK subs, I think, put in a competent but not excellent effort. Lastly, I played the Mau Mau's. The song was The Oath off the Society's Rejects 7-inch. And the Mau Mau's, not quite in the same league as Stiff Little Fingers and UK subs, but certainly maybe a tier below them. In popularity, anyways, not necessarily in songwriting quality. And again, you can hear sort of the difference between those bands that were around from 1977 and maybe the bands that started in 79 and started recording in 81. There's a big sort of gap in approaches to songs. Mau Mau's started off as a band with basically no talent, self-described as no talent, and seemingly great ability to be in the right place at the right time. Now, that isn't to say they didn't work hard or deserved the successes that they had, but appearing on the Wargasm compilation as your sort of opening salvo and opening for the Dead Kennedys and Angelic Upstart certainly won't harm your ability to get people to notice you. Mau Mau's were one of the first UK bands that had a real US influence on their songs, and you can kind of hear that in this particular song. The Oath has a combo of those US influences, but also true to UK 82, that sound. It's a shame that the quality on the first few releases couldn't be maintained, and it didn't help that the band went with a more gothic or, gothic is probably the best way to say it. Gothic sound as they as the years went on, sort of softening and becoming a little more mainstream. Eventually, they dissolved in 1985. Now, Mau Mau's played a lot with not just the big bands that were coming over, like Dead Kennedys and Angelic Upstarts, who were part of their sort of circle of friends. They also played with the smaller bands like Infra Riot and Blitz and those sorts of bands. So they were in tight with that UK 82 crew. Infra Riot are a good one to know because Lee Wilson from Infra Riot, the singer of Infra Riot, produced the Mau Mau's first EP, the one before Society's Rejects. Well, as a beautiful segue, how about some Intro Riot right now?
Try to beat me at the game. You're just shy, you're paranoid. Life will never be the same. I am the winner. Don't need to be tamed. You'll never beat me. I'm my own game. By myself, don't need your help with you. And there's too much pain. Be alone to win it all. You are going to lose this game. I am the winner. Don't need to be tamed. You'll never beat me. I'm my own game.
Guilty box. I find you guilty of trying to fuck the world. I therefore have no choice but to sentence you to life on Earth. Take him away. Every day, fucking cunts are going crazy when I can't rest. This I know we don't care. 'Cause we're gonna fuck the world, gotta do it now. Fuck the world, we don't care. The nation is over, the tears have to be over. The minute close to that, we're pretty good fucking twat. 'Cause we're gonna fuck the world, gotta do it now. All the streets get out of the back will take it best. Join the army, fight for us, go and fuck your wife. Then we're gonna
Okay, a bit of a longer set there. But I wanted to gather up the No Future, Riot City, and Pax bands into sort of one set, and what would later become Peace Punk stuff into another set. So we'll get yet another longer set next. So, before the break, I was talking about Infra Riot, and they were the first song off the block with the song The Winner off the Still Out of Order LP. Now, I could have easily played Emergency from the LP, which is the sort of the song that you sort of know, but I thought I'd dig deeper to provide something a little bit different. And The Winner was a single for the band. Not a lot of people realize that because you probably could find the Still Out of Order LP or even more modern CD, but finding that, the 7 inches from Infra Riot are a little bit rarer. Infra Riot were, to me, sort of, quintessential oi punk middle ground band. They got that sort of chanting, and if I listen to the song again, it has a few little extras that hint of that new wave of British heavy metal stuff. So that, there's a little bit of guitars eking into that metal area. Maybe you don't hear it. If you do, let me know. Let me know I'm not crazy anyways. By the way, The Winner was a single for the band, and yes, it did in fact make it into the 1982 UK indie charts. You're going to hear a lot about the UK indie charts in this podcast because a lot of these bands were big enough to actually get into those charts. And those charts usually meant that they sold between, 700 and, a couple thousand releases that week. So there was a lot of records moving for these bands. Back to the point at hand, though. It's interesting listening to this UK 82 stuff again with a bit of a broader palette of references that I have now in my 40s, as opposed to when I first heard this stuff on things like Punk and Disorderly and UK DK Comp, and which I heard in my teens. All this stuff was really formational for me as a young man. And so it's kind of neat to take another listen to this and hearing all sorts of different stuff pop out. Makes me think it's time to revisit some of the other releases from the era in a deeper way, too. Infra Riot were a relatively short-lived band, lasting from 79 until technically 83, when they changed direction in the name to the Infas, mostly because Secret Records went under, and I assume took the name Infra Riot with them. I think it was also partially, though, according to some of the interviews that I was reading, researching Infra Riot, bringing stuff out of the deep memory recesses. There was a lot of violence around the gigs at the time, especially being in a band that blended oi and punk. you got a lot of Nazi violence. A lot of the National Front, or the NF, were huge in Britain at the time, and gig violence was certainly a thing that happened. To get away from that, change your sound a little, soften yourself up, make it harder for bands to, your audience to have a sort of that macho, visceral reaction to the song. Next after them were One Way System, Stab the Judge, off the 7-inch of the same name, or maybe it's called No Policy if you have the first pressing or second pressing. Either way, you probably have heard One Way System on Punk and Disorderly compilations, and this is classic UK82 sounds. If you don't know what UK82 sounds like, rewind it a little bit and just listen to, well, a lot of the stuff in this set. They have a similarity. The song is fast-ish for the time, at least in the UK. Of course, in America, there was a lot more faster stuff going on. And Discharge and those sorts of bands, Chaos UK, were obviously playing faster as well, but the majority of UK bands were sort of in this middle ground. And another sort of feature, I guess I'll say, of UK82 is that there is a song in there. You can sing along to these things. And despite the roughness around the edges, they are not just a wall of noise hitting you at 900 miles an hour, which is what sometimes hardcore can get to. And frankly, what I like about it. One Way System were around from 1979 to about 86, working with Anagram Records all throughout their career as, well, whatever a career means. Anagram was in turn distributed by Cherry Red Records, which means that their records were widely available. And yes, they did make it into the indie charts in the UK, but only once in 1982, and not for this single. Most of their success was 83 and on, so 1983 and 1984. Again, I think that this particular song is the sort of song that would exemplify the early efforts of a band, and frankly, the stuff that I prefer. After them, I played Mayhem, Dog's Body off the Gentle Murder EP. Now, this is a bit of a deep cut, but it's really one of the top-notch stuff that Riot City Records were putting out in 82. And I think 82 is the peak of that label, for sure. And maybe the peak of, well, UK 82, probably. That only makes sense. So, Mayhem, not a terribly small band, but they were pre-Blitzkrieg, and Blitzkrieg were, a band that got a lot of notoriety because it really amped up the hardcore elements of UK 82 stuff. So, Mayhem put out 3 7-inches in really short order within a span of 2 years, which was a lot of songs. Members of Mayhem were also in The Insane, and we'll talk about them in a minute. And I tell you, this EP is not something I'd listened to ever back in the day. But after doing a little bit of research for UK 82 and the Hardcore 82 March Madness thing, this one came up as sort of like a dark horse, a sleeper pick. I didn't think it was among the top 64, but it may be 65. I think it's that good. If you're into it, it's an underrated ripper. You should definitely find this one and try and purchase it. After them, I played The Insane with El Salvador off the 7-inch of the same name. Now, again, this is not The Insane's best track, but it's the best 1982 track they did, in my opinion. So again, The Insane have connections with Blitzkrieg and Mayhem as well, showing you how sort of tight-knit the No Future Riot City Records crews were. There's a lot of crossover between Riot City and No Future Records, and if you like the one label, chances are you will like the other label. I think Riot City is maybe a little more obscure these days. Lots of people talk about No Future because of Blitz. But yeah, both equally good labels. Both cranked out a lot of records within a very short span. I think between the two labels, there was something like 110 records over the span of like 3 or 4 years, which is just amazing considering that, they're practically 1 or 2 person jobs. This particular single went to number 6 on the UK independent charts and was on the charts for 13 weeks starting in May of 1982. So that's about 3 months. That's pretty impressive considering, the longevity of those UK indie charts were pretty hard to stay on them. While that success might lead you to think that the Insane were on their way to exciting new opportunities, they actually split into two bands due to a dispute, both called, get this, the Insane. So for a short while in late 82 and into 1983, the band existed as two bands with the bassist and drummer Bambi and Dean forming one version and the guitarist and singer Simon and Barry forming the other. The Simon and Barry version recorded the Why Die 7-inch in 1983, and then the band reformed with Bambi and Dean coming back after a brief detour through the band Blitzkrieg. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? Officially, the band called it quits in 1985, but has done some gigs since then. And like every other UK band from the 80s, it seems like they pop up at those sort of giant mega festivals. Back to the first 7-inch by the band for a second, because I did a lot of reading about the Insane, and it struck me as that their story was really kind of interesting. One of the reasons that some people claim the Insane were on Riot City was through a connection to the label through Vice Squad, which is not unusual. Vice Squad members Dave and Shane were essentially the talent feeders for Simon Edwards, who is the owner of Riot City and the guy sort of making things work. But a lot of times, people said that the connection was through Becky Bondage from Vice Squad, because Becky and Bambi from the Insane were dating, in a relationship, I guess is the real way to say it. It's probably more likely that Dave and Shane from Vice Squad brought the Insane to Simon Edwards for their deal, and I'm using air quotes here, you can't see it, but really I am. So don't necessarily pay all the attention to the salacious details. Either way, it could be very true that both elements of the story are true. Maybe the Insane got to Dave and Shane's knowledge through Becky. Who knows? Now, to continue the Vice Squad theme, Chaotic Discord were the next and last band that I played in that set, and I played the Fuck the World track, which is again from the Fuck the World 7-inch on Riot City Records. Now, Dave and Shane from Vice Squad were essentially talent scouts for Riot City, and they also played in this band. And so do yourself a favor and go listen to Vice Squad, and then go listen to Chaotic Discord. Clearly a bit of a different sound. To me, this is a classic fuck band, which is a Vancouver punk term for a band that isn't a real band, just where people get together and play. And of course, then they recorded it and then they got a record out. So maybe it's a fuck band turned to a real band, which is, I guess, how all bands kind of start. Anyways, I think Chaotic Discord were first sort of taking the piss of bands like Chaos UK and Disorder, but finally developed their own sound and found that there was actually some merit to the sound. I kind of get that feeling. I don't know if a more serious approach is the best way to describe it, but there's certainly a development between the single and from 1982 and some of the later stuff, which is only a year or two later. Anyways, enough rambling. Back to the music.
Baby's cry, a baby's smile, and a baby's
that they could take him for a ride. Glad to have his trusty weapon hanging at his side. Hoped that he was man enough to detonate his armaments. Not be like the government, they didn't get its rockets up. Didn't want to think he couldn't take her for a ride. Hoped his trusty weapon would flatter up her pride. Hoped she would be cute enough to detonate his armaments. Not be like the government that couldn't rise to her defense. Soft touch! Soft touch! Soft touch! Poor little lovebirds out for a drink. Both of them were scared of what the other one might think. Had to prove his manhood, show her his virility. She had to be a spark to shoot off his artillery. He had asked her out that night, mostly out of friendliness. She thought it was a chance to break out of her loneliness. Needed reassurance she could patch it with a beauty. If the truth was told, he wasn't feeling very fruity. Cut a boring story short, the time she came to go to bed. They were tired, they were drunk, both of them were full of dread. Hoped she would be cute enough to detonate his armaments. He felt like the government that couldn't get his rockets up. Soft touch! Soft touch! He didn't want to be a soft, soft touch! He didn't want to be a soft touch! What to do? It seemed a shame they couldn't go to sleep content. He turned up the other way, laid his head beside her cot. With his tongue he loved her love, but with his lips he kissed her sweet. She discovered to her joy, softness was ecstasy. So they realised that sex didn't have to be a fight. Time and time again they made energetic peace that night. Both ways up and both ways round, with no attack, no defence. Beat the government with sexual disarmament. Soft touch! Soft touch! Soft touch! Soft touch! He didn't want to be a soft, soft touch! He didn't want to be a, didn't want to be
con. A look at the past history tells all government is wrong.
Exposes were first in that set with the 10,000 marching feet off the 7-inch of the same name. This is a perfect example of a band who did a lot. 5 releases over 4 years, and then had lots of stuff after their demise. At least 3 or 4 CDs, all sorts of singles, all sorts of live tracks. Just insane how much stuff was actually recorded and then committed to CD, vinyl, digital, so that somebody could buy it. Now, who's demanding an Exposes CD discography from 2006? Very few people, I suppose. Anyways, Andy Tez Turner eventually joined the Instigators after being not after being, actually, towards the end of being in Exposes. It seems like Exposes sort of was like a sibling band to the Instigators, and they played together a lot. And as the Instigators were falling apart at the time, Andy moved from Exposes to the Instigators. The Instigators were, of course, terribly prolific as well, and so you wonder if the common theme is Andy. The Instigators, of course, toured the U.S. in the late 80s and early 90s, so there was a sort of a long lineage there. Exposes didn't have a ton of mainstream success, and not a lot of stuff that I could dig up about them that was notable or worthwhile. That's not to say that the song isn't notable or worthwhile. I think it certainly does, and again, it did hit the indie charts in March of 1982, so lots of people bought this. And you can hear why. It's a great song. After that, I played Omega Tribe, and I played the song Is This a Future? Off the Angry Song 7-inch. Now, this is on Crass Records by merely looking at the cover, and you can feel a similarity, but these songs are much, much less abrasive and much more in tune with UK 82. So you can understand where and why Omega Tribe became somewhat popular in later 82. Of course, they weren't as large as Crass, but who the fuck was? Crass were selling 10,000 units off of every release. So, what else about Omega Tribe? Well, not much. So, continuing on the Crass and Peace Punk theme, I'll touch on Poison Girls. And the song I played was Soft Touch off of the Where's the Pleasure LP. Now, Where's the Pleasure is not on Crass, although Poison Girls' earlier releases were. And they're not your typical punk band by any stretch of the definition. Of course, you've got saxophone, you've got all sorts of other bits in Poison Girls that are not in anything else I've played today. And again, Soft Touch is probably not the best song to pick for a top 64, but I think it is crucially important for a couple of reasons. So the singer of Poison Girls is a woman named Vice Versa. She was already a mother of 2 when the band started in 1979 and was much older than her bandmates. And you can tell that her maturity in the lyrics that she's singing and the subjects she's taking on and the feminism approach is much more, I won't say real, but real. The words that she's singing are absolutely head and shoulders way above whatever anyone else is putting out in 1982. Nobody's dealing with the issues that Poison Girls ended up dealing with. And so, while Where's the Pleasure is the second LP by the band, and even more melodic than the first, it's probably the last of their purely punk records. The subsequent ones add more synthesizers and other stuff. So it starts to drift even further from punk. I think this one is an important footnote in my top 64 anyways, in that if we were judging it on lyrics alone, I think this is probably the most intelligent and well-written songs from 1982. As it happens, I played after that, Ahead's Dying Man. Dying Man came out in 1982, but didn't get too much success because the record company sleeve looks like a fucking disco record. And so if you're trying to market a punk band with a disco record looking thing, you're gonna get fucked. So thankfully it was repressed with a punker sleeve, and you can actually hear how did that first disco-like sleeve ever get applied to this band. It's nowhere near a disco band. Anyways, boggles my mind. By 1983, it had gotten into the UK independent charts, but it never got there in 82. It was a late 82 release anyways. Great song, catchy. One of those songs that I kind of feel bad about not making the cut. But, you know, it is what it is. It's not the Subhumans' Religious Wars. And if you're wondering why this song reminds you of perhaps the UK Subhumans, it's because the rhythm section is the same. So it's no wonder that Aheads ended up on Blurg and playing with the Subhumans a lot in their existence. Lastly, wrapping this set up, I played Conflict, Blind Attack off the House That Man Built 7-inch. Everyone is probably aware of who Conflict are and their place in UK punk history, and whether your opinion of them is controversial or combative, or whether they're controversial or combative, lots have been said about their band recently, and the problems of being so politically outspoken earlier on into your career is that it can paint you into a corner that you basically can't escape. With that said, it's refreshing to listen to this after a few years of not listening to Conflict. I really listened to a lot of Conflict in 87, 88, 89. It was kind of like a go-to band for me. And, when I had sort of discovered the joys of UK punk, Conflict, Crass, Subhumans, those were my sort of touchstones. And I think as a Canadian, those were the songs that we sort of grew up on, rather than maybe just the Dead Kennedys, Circle Jerks, and some of the more lesser known. Yeah, the more lesser known. Sure, I'll say that. The more lesser known US acts. It seemed like we had a much more influence from the UK. I don't know if that was just the distributorship was much better in Canadian terms. Canada was only granted full independence until I want to say 1982. I should probably know that. If I'm going to pull that fact from the air, I should have probably Googled that. But yeah, we were a UK sovereign, not sovereign. We were a UK subject, and still are to some extent. Like, we have the Queen on our money. What the fuck does that mean? Anyways, so UK punk records were easier to get often than, say, Bad Brains or even Black Flag. So there was a lot of issues with that growing up. Anyways, so I grew up with a lot of Conflict is really what I'm saying. It's interesting to hear this stuff, but I don't know that this is the best stuff, and so therefore it doesn't get into the top 64. I think Conflict's best stuff comes in 84 through 85. There's like 3 albums in a row that are just killer, up until maybe even 88 or 89. I don't mind Against All Odds and The Final Conflict, which I think is maybe even 90 and 91, 92 even. I kind of like some of that stuff. So this early stuff just seems to me to miss some of the later snarl, anger, and aggression, especially when you listen to something like the live cuts of this song. Blind Attack live, even 2 years later, is just so much more searing and powerful. So just for that alone, I can't put this into the top 64. Anyways, more music.
city at night. The tall dark buildings cast this ghostly shadow to his burning eyes. Oh, Rome, Romeo, Romeo, Rome, Romeo, yeah. Cruised the streets at night, and under his feet lay all the remains of all the cruisers before him. But out of the alley comes these green laser eyes, saying, closer, closer. But he's still alone. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, Rome. Romeo, yeah. Romeo, Rome, Romeo. Romeo, he walks the cities at night. The tall dark buildings cast their ghostly shadows in his burning eyes. Around the corners, there's nothing there, nothing there, nothing there. Juliet! Juliet! Little Juliet, babe! Romeo, 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 Romeo. Cause you know Juliet, cause you know Juliet, cause you know Juliet. Oh, Romeo.
And so first I played Red Cross, Linda Blair off the Born Innocent 12-inch EP, which has in and of itself its own tumultuous history. Much like Linda Blair in The Exorcist. That's how tumultuous. This is really also a pivot point for Red Cross, moving towards a more rock sound, and you can hear it clearly on the song Linda Blair. Needless to say, the band became more mainstream players even further out from this point into the 1990s during the great major label grab of underground rock in the grunge era. So if you never heard early Red Cross, do yourself a favor. It's really good. I didn't like this album for a long time, or this 12-inch rather, but it's sort of grown on me as I've become more appreciative of rock in general. In hindsight, maybe this song could have made the top 64, but I wanted to ensure that I had some representation from other countries. Certainly because those other countries maybe don't get recognized as often as US hardcore does. So it's probably likely I could have done a whole list of 64 just in North America, just in the North American releases. So nonetheless, the band could write a tune, and a song this good, were it written a couple of years later, say 1987, would have easily cracked the top 64 and probably the top 10. Well, maybe not top 10, but you get the point. As you might know, Red Cross were sued by the International Red Cross just after this was first released. So the medical organization were unhappy with Red Cross taking their name, and so Red Cross changed the spelling of the name to Red Cross. Well, yeah, okay. REDDKROSS. And that solved any confusion that people might have felt between a medical organization and a rock band. I tell you, sometimes people are stupid. The Born Innocent 12-inch was released first on Smoke 7, which was run by Felix Alanis of RF7. And RF7 have a cut in the top 64. Useless trivia fact, I guess. And then later re-released in 1986 on Frontier Records with some additional compilation tracks. So it expanded the 12-inch to a full LP. It also changed the cover. So if you see the sort of psychedelic 60s kind of cover from the 86 version on Frontier, that's one of the reasons why. It better reflected what Red Cross sounded like at that time. After Red Cross, I played Wipers, Romeo from the single of the same name. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Wipers. Anyone who knows me knows I find the Wipers far too repetitive. But I'm not unfair. So the Wipers are definitely an important keystone band, especially for Portland. And this was their only 82 release, and they deserve at least a mention. So here's where they get it. Romeo is, by the way, I think the weakest song that the Wipers did in their entire career. That includes some of Greg Sage's probably later stuff. I'd even put it below some of the songs that Greg Sage did as a solo artist, acoustic, whatever. I just think this song kind of stinks. But the 7-inch version is moderately better than the version that came out on 1983's Over the Edge. And Christ, I tell you, if Over the Edge came out in 82, I would have put Over the Edge in the top 64. How important are the Wipers to Portland, Oregon? Well, from the perspective of punk, they, Poison Idea, and Tragedy are the top 3 most important Portland punk bands. Other people may argue some of the other sort of lesser knowns because they have a personal axe to grind against any of those other bands. But, the Wipers were incredibly important. They were started in 77. And let me tell you, the guy knows how to write a song. For full disclosure, though, the problem that I have with Romeo specifically is that it's so repetitive. And for me, a song that's pushing 4 minutes needs to actually develop somewhere in that fucking song. And you can rake me over the coals if you like. I don't think it does that. Now, again, Greg Sage may come and email me and go, well, that's not the reason I wrote the song that way. I don't give a fuck. It just isn't their best work. Anyways, I know lots of people like the Wipers, so that's one of the reasons why they're here. Sin 34 were next, and I played Join the Race off the Die Laughing EP. And often cited as among the first LA hardcore bands to have a female singer, I find that a bit of a spurious note, because punk and hardcore are probably on the same continuum. And so you could say some of those early bands were early punk bands, like the Bags, thinking specifically about LA punk bands. The Bags were definitely a hardcore band. I know other people may disagree with that, but so be it. Anyways, I digress. If you dig past the surface of the early 80s hardcore scene in California, you'll discover bands like Sin 34, who clearly weren't as big as the Dead Kennedys and X and Circle Jerks, but were often playing support to those bands. Indeed, I think that there was such a wealth of good California bands in 82 that even deep into the depths you'll find great bands. Sin 34 are one of those, cohesive, political, and definitively influenced by US hardcore, whereas other bands might have been influenced by US punk. Sin 34 are clearly listening to the Necros, the Misfits, Minor Threat, those bands, and building songs in that sort of influence sphere. Dave Markey, a really notable filmmaker, was the drummer of the band. Die Laughing came out within a year of the band starting, and it's a great slice of the energy and sound of the early 80s California hardcore sound, which is not as monolithic as I'm making it sound out to be, but it's a great example of that sort of work. Sin 34 sort of hung around until 85 and then broke up. They got back together periodically for sort of reunion one-offs until the recent death of the singer. Lastly, I played Oligarchy by Bad Religion, which seemed like a natural sort of thing to do in this era. It was off of the 1982 LP How Could Hell Be Any Worse? And again, that seems sort of strangely prescient in our current political state, which is the first of really 4 LPs, excepting the Into the Known LP, which was dabbling in gothic synthesizers and more mainstream 80s sounds that we should probably dive into at some point. But let's accept that as a outlier. I think those 4 LPs really solidified a specific SoCal sound, which has become what pop punk wishes it could be in some ways. I kind of hate Bad Religion for introducing the world to such oral abominations as Sum 41 and Blink-182, but sometimes you can't blame the parents for the way the kids turned out, you know what I mean? Sometimes they're just little shits through and through and need to be, thrown in a vat of boiling tar. Regardless, Bad Religion, much like many other bands, have outlasted their peak and, in my opinion, are kind of coasting along. But their peak lasted, in my estimation, from 82 to 88, maybe even in 1989. Either way, you're probably, already heard more about Bad Religion than you need to, and frankly, there's plenty of mainstream and underground press that talks about them. So feel free to use the computer in your hand or on your desk to look them up if they're new to you. You'll probably find a million articles with Greg Graffin or Brett Garowitz. I'd suggest you start at the album Suffer, then go to No Control, How Could Hell Be Any Worse, and then finish with Against the Grain. If you've done that all in one sitting, you probably like it, and you'll probably like the other stuff. And then you can branch out to the other sort of Epitaph-related bands. Although Epitaph, again, good label, didn't have sort of the overarching sonic imprint that Bad Religion did, although you probably like Pennywise and NoFX. On that note, I'm going to stop talking about pop punk bands that you probably know already. I'm John Kurtoff, and this podcast has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit General Admission at medium.com/general-admission. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's GENADM Show, so Gen Adam Show. I guess that doesn't really work, does it? If you're old and like to email, it's generaladmissionshow@gmail.com. That's all one word, all lowercase. And if you didn't like this podcast, in the words of the amazing Big Boys, go make your own podcast.